I have given you everything. What more do you want from me?
My name is Caroline Rivers. I'm 32 years old, and this is the story of how I stopped chasing the love of people who never intended to give it. On the morning of my wedding day, a day that's supposed to be one of the most magical moments in a woman's life, I stood alone in the bridal suite of Willamette Valley Vineyard, staring at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The silk of my gown hugged me perfectly, each crystal hand sewn into the fabric catching the light like tiny constellations. My makeup artist had done wonders. My cheekbones looked sharper, my lips a soft shade of rose. And yet, for all the perfection reflected back at me, my chest felt hollow. I checked my phone again for the 14th time in 20 minutes. No messages from Mom. Nothing from Dad. Not even a text from my brother Logan, whose approval they had always chased more fiercely than they ever pursued mine. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the phone back on the vanity, next to the bouquet of white roses waiting patiently, much like I had waited my entire life to be seen. A soft knock broke the silence. It was Martha, the wedding planner, poking her head in with a smile too practiced to be real. "It's time. Caroline, are you ready?" she asked. "Ready." The word echoed bitterly inside me. I walked toward the window and looked down at the ceremony space below. 90 guests filled neat rows of white chairs, their laughter carried by the soft notes of a string quartet. Everything was beautiful, except for the 3 empty seats in the front row, glaring back at me like accusations. "They're not coming, are they?" My voice cracked before I could stop it. "There's still time," Martha said, but we both knew it was a lie. I took one last deep breath, smoothed the fabric of my gown, and whispered to myself, "Let's go." The doors opened, and as I stepped into the sunlight, 90 heads turned, all eyes on me. But I'd never felt more invisible. The whispers started almost immediately, polite murmurs hidden behind cupped hands. Some guests smiled at me with pity, others avoided my gaze altogether. I could feel their sympathy brushing against my skin like unwelcome hands. My parents' absence was louder than the music, heavier than the dress, sharper than the autumn wind. I forced myself to focus on Ethan, my fiancé, waiting at the altar. His eyes were steady, his smile unwavering, the only anchor in a sea of humiliation. As I reached him, he gently took my hands and whispered, "I'm here. We're enough." And for a fleeting moment, I believed him. But beneath the surface, my mind wasn't standing under a floral arch in Oregon. It was back in our Seattle living room, decades ago. I was 8, clutching an art contest certificate. My teacher said showed exceptional talent. My parents barely glanced at it. "That's nice, honey," Mom muttered, stirring the pot on the stove. Dad ruffled my hair absently, his eyes already on Logan's new debate trophy. "Your brother needs more support. He's going places," Dad said. I remember swallowing that sentence like medicine, bitter, necessary. And then the one that would define my teenage years. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" So I tried. I studied harder, won academic awards, earned scholarships, built a company. Each success was another desperate attempt to make them look my way. But no matter how bright I shone, they were always looking elsewhere. Now, here I was, a bride without parents, a daughter still waiting to be enough. The ceremony continued. I spoke my vows, my voice trembling at first but gaining strength with every word. I choose a future based on seeing each other clearly, I said to Ethan, and he understood the weight of that promise more than anyone else. When the officiant declared us husband and wife, Ethan's mother wrapped me in a warm embrace. "You're one of us now," she whispered, and for the first time that day, the tightness in my chest loosened just a little. The reception was beautiful. Friends danced with us under fairy lights, laughter filled the air, and for a while, I almost forgot about the 3 empty chairs. But then Sarah, my college roommate, raised her glass and toasted, "To finding the family who deserves you." The room murmured in agreement, and the words hit me like a tidal wave. Deserves you. I had spent 3 decades chasing people who never intended to deserve me. Later that night, I slipped away from the celebration and checked my phone one last time. No missed calls. No messages. Not even a single congratulations. Ethan found me there, staring at the blank screen. "They missed something beautiful today," he said softly. "They did," I replied. And for the first time, I felt the smallest flicker of defiance. Their absence was no longer my shame. It was theirs. But even as I whispered those words, part of me, the part still shaped by a lifetime of invisibility, refused to let go. Because deep down, I still wanted what every daughter wants. A text that says we're proud of you. A phone call that says we love you. A family that shows up. That text never came. And that silence would become the fuel that powered everything I built in the years to follow. It's strange the way pain becomes purpose. That empty front row, those unchecked messages, the quiet dismissal I'd endured since childhood, they stopped being wounds and became reasons. Reasons to build, to fight, to prove. I didn't know it yet, but that day, the day my parents chose not to come, wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of the rest of my life. Because when love is withheld, something remarkable can happen. You learn to give it to yourself. The morning after the wedding, I woke up next to Ethan with sunlight pouring softly through our curtains, and a silence that was deafening. There were no messages from Mom or Dad waiting on my phone, no belated congratulations, no half-hearted sorry we couldn't make it. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had once again proven their capacity for conditional attention. I stared at the blank screen for a long time before I powered the phone off and placed it face down on the nightstand. That was the first quiet act of defiance I'd ever allowed myself, choosing peace over disappointment. The weeks that followed were filled with newlywed bliss and a surprising new energy. Maybe it was rage, or maybe it was the first taste of freedom, but something in me had shifted. I stopped obsessing over how to earn my parents' love and started focusing on building a life that didn't require it. At first, that meant throwing myself into work. Crescent Motion Studio, my small digital media company, was still in its infancy back then. Just 3 employees working out of a cramped office above a bakery. We didn't have big investors or corporate partners. What we had was relentless creativity, caffeine-fueled brainstorming sessions that ran past midnight, and the stubborn belief that we could make something great. I spent every hour I could on that business. Days blurred into nights as I pitched clients, developed campaigns, and fought tooth and nail for every opportunity. My parents never called to ask how it was going. They never once asked what I was building, but I stopped expecting them to. Their silence stopped being a wound and became a strange kind of fuel. Every ignored phone call, every forgotten birthday was a log thrown onto the fire of my ambition. 5 years later, that fire roared into something undeniable. Crescent Motion wasn't a 3-person startup anymore. It was a respected creative agency with over 60 employees, international clients, and campaigns that had gone viral. We were known for our storytelling, for our innovation, for our stubborn refusal to follow trends. And then, in a moment that felt like both a victory lap and a liberation, a major tech conglomerate acquired Crescent Motion for $21 million. I remember the day we signed the deal. My team filled the office with champagne and cheers. To Caroline, Jen, my creative director, toasted, the woman who built something from nothing while certain people weren't looking. Everyone laughed, but I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes. She didn't know how literally she'd described my life. They weren't looking. Not when I won my first design award. Not when we landed our first 6-figure contract. And certainly not when I sold the company I'd built from the ground up. When the headlines hit the business news, I allowed myself a small hope that maybe, finally, my parents would call. Surely even they couldn't ignore this. But when I opened Instagram that evening, the first thing I saw wasn't a text or a call. It was a photo of Logan, my older brother, at a fundraiser for his law firm. Mom and Dad stood on either side of him, beaming proudly, their arms around his twin daughters. "Family tradition continues," the caption read. I scrolled further. There was a photo of their family vacation in Hawaii, another of Dad's retirement party, and a dozen more from events I hadn't been invited to, moments I hadn't even known were happening. My existence, meanwhile, was summed up by a single birthday post. "Happy birthday, Caroline?" No photo, no memory, no acknowledgement of anything I had achieved. Just 8 empty words from people who had spent a lifetime overlooking me. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they didn't know what to say. Maybe they were proud, but didn't know how to express it. But deep down, I knew the truth, the same truth I'd known since childhood. My success wasn't the kind they valued. It wasn't theirs to boast about at dinner parties or parade around the neighborhood. It was mine, and that made it irrelevant to them. Still, their silence told me something more important than any compliment could. They were never going to see me. Not really. And once I accepted that, I stopped trying to make them. But something else gnawed at me. An uncomfortable observation that only grew sharper the more I thought about it. Logan's life, the luxury vacations, the private school for his kids, the multi-million-dollar home didn't make sense on his law firm's income. Rumors from distant relatives confirmed what I suspected. Mom and Dad had been quietly funding his lifestyle for years, draining their retirement savings to prop him up. The realization was equal parts infuriating and liberating. They had never been indifferent. They had been deliberate. They had chosen Logan, chosen to invest their love, their time, and their money into him. And they had chosen to leave me out. And yet, despite all their sacrifices, despite the money and support and pride they poured into my brother, it was me who had built something from nothing. Me who had turned neglect into success. Me who had become someone they couldn't ignore, even if they tried. That thought, the knowledge that I didn't need them, planted the seed of an idea. I had spent a lifetime chasing their approval. What if, instead, I showed them and myself that I had never needed it in the first place? One crisp autumn morning, as I stared out the window of my corner office, that idea crystallized into a single, simple decision. I called my financial advisor and said the words that would change everything. I want to complete the purchase today. The Porsche Taycan, metallic gray. It was extravagant, unnecessary, a ridiculous indulgence, and it was exactly what I wanted. Because for once, I wasn't doing something to impress them. I was doing it for me, because I had earned it. I posted one photo to Instagram, the Porsche parked in my driveway, gleaming in the afternoon sun. The caption was just 2 words, dreams realized. And then I waited. For 3 days, there was silence, the same silence I had known my whole life. But on the 4th, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in 5 years. Mom calling. The screen glowed with a name that used to mean everything, and now meant almost nothing. Mom calling. 2 simple words that once would have sent me scrambling to answer, eager for a crumb of approval. But this time, I stared at the phone as it buzzed on the kitchen counter, my pulse steady, my heart strangely calm. After 5 years of silence, they had finally reached out. And I didn't need a psychic to know why. I swiped to answer. Hello? Caroline. Mom's voice carried that same blend of authority and urgency she always used in family crises. The tone that said you owe us your attention. We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow. Family meeting? I repeated, letting the disbelief bleed into my voice. After 5 years of nothing, you're calling about a family meeting? This is important, she insisted. I heard Dad's voice faintly in the background. Tell her it's important. Like I couldn't hear him. What's important? I asked. My wedding wasn't important. The company acquisition wasn't important. What exactly matters now? There was a pause, that heavy, familiar silence they used when they knew they were caught. Then Mom spoke again, her voice tight. It's complicated. Financial issues. We need to discuss it as a family. Of course. They saw the Porsche. They must have seen the business headlines too. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. Tomorrow at 2, I said flatly, and hung up. The next day, I slid into the Porsche, leather seats cool against my back, the hum of the engine like a low, confident heartbeat. The 40-minute drive to my childhood home was longer than I remembered. Maybe because, with every mile, memories resurfaced, birthdays celebrated without them, holidays spent alone while they hosted Logan and his family, milestones that passed without a single phone call. By the time I pulled into the circular driveway, I had replayed every slight, every absence, every dismissal, and I was done carrying their weight. The house loomed in front of me, just as it always had, white shutters, manicured hedges, a facade of perfection. But the Porsche parked at the curb was a new element in the picture, a metallic reminder that I was no longer the overlooked daughter they could manipulate. Before I could knock, the door swung open. Mom and Dad stood there, their faces shifting from annoyance to shock as their eyes landed on the car. "You've done well for yourself," Dad said finally. Not hello, not I've missed you. Just an evaluation of my net worth. "Yes," I replied simply. They led me to the dining room, the same one where I'd once been lectured about being more like your brother. Logan and his wife, Hannah, were already seated at the table, their faces arranged into practiced masks of concern. "Caroline," Logan said, nodding like we'd spoken last week instead of half a decade ago. "Let's get straight to business," Dad said, pulling out a stack of financial folders. But I didn't sit. I stayed standing, my purse clutched tightly in my hand, the only outward sign of the turmoil churning beneath my calm surface. "No," I said quietly. "First, I'd like to know why I'm suddenly important enough to include in family discussions after being excluded from everything else for years." Mom and Dad exchanged a glance. Logan shifted uncomfortably. "We can discuss that later," Mom said, her tone slipping into the dismissive register I knew too well. "We have more pressing matters now." "I'm not in a rush," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm not interested in being convenient family only when you need something." For the first time in my adult life, I saw uncertainty flicker across my father's face. And that's when I knew they needed me. And for once, I had the power. The truth came out in pieces. Logan's mortgage was 3 months overdue. The twins' private school tuition hadn't been paid. Their lifestyle, the one my parents had bankrolled for years, was collapsing under its own weight. "You need to help your brother," Dad said, sliding a set of loan documents across the table. "Think about your nieces and nephews," Mom added, her voice catching just so, the same way it used to when she wanted me to feel guilty. "We're family," Logan said sharply. "That's what family does. When one of us succeeds, we help the others." I said nothing. I just let the silence stretch until it felt like a wall. "Where were you at my wedding?" I asked finally. Logan blinked. "What?" "My wedding. 2 years ago. Where were you?" Mom's hand fluttered to her throat. "We were busy. Logan had that event with his firm." "It wasn't convenient," Dad added. I nodded slowly. "And yet here you are now, because you saw the Porsche on Instagram." Logan's face flushed. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I asked, leaning forward. "I built everything alone. Every scholarship, every client, every late night. Where were any of you?" "You were always so independent," Dad said, as if that were a flaw. "We had to support Logan. He had more potential." "You were parents in title only," I said, my voice startlingly calm. "You missed my graduation, my scholarship ceremony, my company launch, my wedding. You missed my life, and now you want to share in what that life has built. Silence fell again. The weight of years hung in the room. And in that moment, I realized something profound. They weren't just asking for money. They were asking for access to the success they had no part in creating. Then I opened my briefcase. Their eyes lit up, expecting a checkbook. Instead, I slid a single document across the table. "This," I said, "is the announcement for the Rivera Media Scholarship Foundation. $16 million to fund young women in digital media arts, girls who were overlooked, like I was." The room went dead silent. "16 million?" Logan sputtered. "Named after Miss Rivera," I continued, "the teacher who came to every one of my art shows when you couldn't be bothered. The money is legally protected in a foundation trust." "You're wasting it on strangers," Logan shouted. "On girls who deserve better than what I got," I replied, snapping my briefcase shut. And then I held up my phone, the recording app running. "I've documented every manipulative word from today, every guilt trip, every demand, just in case anyone tries to challenge the foundation legally." I turned and walked toward the door. "You can't just leave." Logan's voice cracked. "We need that money." I paused, my hand on the doorknob. "No, Logan. What you needed was to show up. At my graduation. At my company launch. At my wedding. But that opportunity has passed." The door closed behind me with a click that sounded like freedom. The door's click still echoed in my ears as I walked to the car, each step feeling lighter, sharper, a rhythm I'd never known when leaving that house before. The Caroline who once begged to be seen had vanished. In her place stood someone who understood her own worth. But that didn't mean the battle was over. It was only just beginning. By the time I slid behind the wheel of the Porsche and felt the quiet hum beneath me, the adrenaline started to fade, replaced by something colder, clarity. They had come to me not because they loved me, but because they needed what I had built. And in their minds, that meant they were entitled to it. The phone buzzed nonstop that night, messages from Mom laced with guilt, from Dad filled with practical reasoning, from Logan dripping with entitlement. "Think about the kids. We're family. You're being selfish." I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and stared out the window of the apartment Ethan and I shared, a space built entirely without a single dollar of River's family money. That fact alone seemed to enrage them more than anything. And yet, for the first time, I felt no guilt. The next morning, I woke up to a storm. Dozens of missed calls. Multiple voicemails, some tearful, some angry. And then a text from Ethan. "Your brother is calling people, trying to reach our investors. Be ready." Predictable, manipulative, desperate. But I had anticipated this. I had set things in motion long before the confrontation, legally establishing the Rivera Media Foundation, securing every dollar in a trust, and preparing for precisely this storm. They could rage, threaten, guilt trip all they wanted. They would never touch what I had built. And still, the fallout came fast. A week later, the Portland Chronicle published a story about a family dispute, clearly leaked by Logan. But the plan backfired spectacularly when the reporter asked one simple question: why didn't you attend your sister's wedding? The silence that followed spoke volumes. The article painted a devastating picture: parents absent for milestones, now suddenly interested when money was involved. Social media latched on to the narrative. Former classmates, business partners, even distant relatives reached out with messages of solidarity. We always wondered why they never mentioned you. You deserve better. For the first time in my life, public opinion was on my side. Even more satisfying was the shift behind closed doors. Logan's desperate attempts to reach my investors were met with polite refusals. My board stood firm. My company's reputation soared, and applications for the foundation began pouring in months ahead of launch. But the Rivers family wasn't done. A week later, they showed up, unannounced, at my office. "Miss Rivers, your family is here." "They're causing a scene," Janine from reception said over the phone, her voice carefully neutral. Through the glass walls, I saw them, Mom shouting, her hands slicing the air, pearls swinging wildly as she declared to anyone who would listen that I was abandoning my family. Logan's face was flushed crimson, his body language radiating frustration and entitlement. Dad stood slightly apart, silent but seething. "Have security escort them out," I said calmly. "Professionally, please." My team watched me for a reaction, for a hint of anger or pain. But I simply smoothed my skirt, walked to the office door, and said, "It's being handled. Let's get back to work." As they were escorted toward the elevators, Logan's voice boomed across the lobby. "This isn't over, Caroline. We have obligations to each other. You can't just ignore them." But that's exactly what I planned to do. That evening, I drafted an email that would become a turning point. "I have documented your repeated attempts to contact me at my workplace. Any further attempts will result in a formal complaint. All communication regarding family matters must be directed through my attorney." His contact information is attached. Patricia, my therapist, called it setting a boundary. To me, it felt like drawing a line in concrete. How did it feel sending that? She asked during our next session. "Necessary," I said, tracing the pattern on the armchair fabric. "Not satisfying, but necessary?" She nodded. "What you're seeing now isn't new behavior. It's the same pattern, just louder because they're losing control." That word, control, sat heavy in my chest. All those years, they hadn't just withheld love, they'd used it as leverage. Every compliment, every ounce of attention was conditional. And now that I'd stopped playing their game, they were flailing for new ways to pull me back in. But nothing prepared me for the escalation. A week later, I received a call from the Portland Business Journal requesting an interview about the foundation. I agreed, on one condition: no questions about family. The story that came out was titled "Self-Made Success Creates Legacy of Support," and it went viral. The public narrative was now cemented. I wasn't a bitter daughter withholding money. I was a visionary, turning pain into purpose. The timing couldn't have been worse for Logan. Within days, his mortgage default became public record. Their carefully crafted image as a picture-perfect family began to crumble. Hannah's social standing evaporated overnight. The twins were quietly withdrawn from their expensive private school. The empire they'd built on my parents' blind support was collapsing, while the one I'd built alone was thriving. And through it all, the one thought that sustained me was this: I didn't do this to punish them. I did this to free myself. Weeks later, I received an invitation from the Women in Media Alliance. I had been nominated for the Business Leadership Award. Standing at the podium, looking out over a crowd that celebrated me, not because of my last name, but because of my work, I felt something I had never felt before: complete independence. In that moment, I realized the power dynamic had shifted forever. They could no longer define me. They could no longer shame me. They could no longer control me. And most importantly, they could no longer ignore me. Because the girl they overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated had become a woman they could no longer afford to forget. And this time, I wasn't building for them. I was building for me, and for every invisible girl who had ever been told she didn't matter. The weeks after the confrontation felt like standing in the eye of a storm. Everything was calm on the surface. The foundation was moving forward. My company was thriving, and Ethan and I were living our lives. But I knew the chaos was swirling just beyond the horizon. It started slowly. A text here, a voicemail there. Then the messages multiplied, each more desperate and manipulative than the last. Mom's tone shifted from tearful pleas to scathing accusations. Dad's messages oscillated between cold rationalizations and self-pitying monologues about family duty. Logan sent furious emails filled with entitlement, as if I had personally betrayed him by refusing to bankroll his mistakes. At first, I deleted them all without listening, but curiosity got the better of me one night, and I played one of Mom's voicemails. "Caroline, please. This isn't like you. Family sticks together. People are starting to talk about how you turned your back on us. How could you do this after everything we've done for you?" I laughed out loud. Everything they'd done for me. The same people who'd skipped my graduation, who hadn't attended a single art show, who had ignored my wedding as if it were a minor inconvenience. They were now rewriting history to cast themselves as the victims. They weren't mourning the loss of a relationship. They were mourning the loss of control. But the louder they screamed, the more the world started to notice something deeper. The Portland Chronicle ran a follow-up piece on the Rivera Media Foundation, highlighting how the scholarship was already receiving hundreds of applications. The Business Journal published a feature calling my decision an act of radical generosity. And when news broke that Logan's house had gone into foreclosure, paired with the revelation that my parents had bankrolled his lifestyle for years, public sympathy shifted entirely in my direction. For once, the narrative was clear. I wasn't a selfish daughter hoarding money. I was a self-made woman who had finally drawn a line. It wasn't revenge, it was freedom. My parents, however, couldn't accept that. One afternoon, as I reviewed scholarship applications in my office, Janine's voice crackled through the intercom again. "Miss Rivers, your family is back." And this time they brought a pastor. I sighed and rose from my chair, walking toward the glass wall that overlooked the lobby. There they were, Mom, red-faced and weeping, clutching a Bible as if divine intervention might change my mind. Dad, stern and stiff, trying to look authoritative but visibly unraveling. Logan, his anger barely contained. And Pastor Wilson, from the church I'd stopped attending years ago, standing awkwardly beside them. "Have security escort them out," I said, not even hesitating. But before they could be removed, Mom's voice echoed through the lobby, loud enough for the entire office to hear. "My daughter is abandoning her family. After all we sacrificed for her." No one in my office said a word. They didn't need to. They'd heard enough of my story over the years to know the truth. That night, I sent a final email. Any further attempts to contact me at my workplace will be considered harassment and reported accordingly. All family-related communication must go through my attorney. This boundary is final. Patricia, my therapist, smiled when I showed her the message. Direct. Firm. Healthy. "It doesn't feel satisfying," I admitted. "It's not supposed to," she said gently. "It's supposed to keep you safe." The following weeks were a study in desperation. Two of my childhood friends, people who hadn't spoken to me in over a decade, suddenly reached out. "Your parents are heartbroken," one said. "The holidays are for forgiveness," said the other. Logan's wife, Hannah, emailed me photos of the twins in Halloween costumes with the message, "They ask about you constantly." It was so transparent, using children as leverage, that I almost felt sick. Then came the moral appeals. Their family attorney called, urging me to remember my obligations. Pastor Wilson left a voicemail about reconciliation. Even distant relatives wrote letters implying that my refusal to help was a reflection of my character. But none of them used the word sorry. Not once. And that was the truth at the center of all of this. They weren't trying to mend what was broken. They were trying to manipulate me into restoring their comfort. Still, their words lingered in the corners of my mind, and one night, as Ethan and I sat on the couch reviewing applications, I found myself voicing a question I hadn't dared ask aloud. What if I'm wrong? Ethan looked up from his laptop. About what? About cutting them off, I said. If I'm telling these girls, these scholarship recipients, to find their strength, am I doing the right thing by walking away from my family? Is setting boundaries the same as running away? He studied me for a moment. If one of those girls came to you with a story like yours, what would you tell her? I didn't hesitate. I'd tell her she deserves people who see her worth. Then why should you hold yourself to a different standard? He asked. His words settled into the quiet space between us like an anchor. He was right. Setting boundaries wasn't running away. It was refusing to keep walking back into a burning house. 2 weeks later, I hosted a dinner at our home, not for the family that shared my blood, but for the family I had chosen. Ethan sat at the head of the table beside me. Naomi, my first investor and now close friend, clinked glasses with my creative team. and at the far end sat Maya, a 17-year-old filmmaker and one of the first recipients of the Rivera Media Scholarship. The dining room glowed with candlelight. Laughter filled the air. There was no tension, no judgment, no invisible scoreboard tracking my worth. To those who see us as we are, I said, raising my glass. To those who see us, the room echoed. That night, I announced a mentorship program for all future scholarship recipients. This isn't just about money, I told them. It's about building something meaningful, together. Maya's eyes widened. You'll be mentoring us yourself. Every step of the way, I promised. The next morning, the Portland News aired a special feature on the foundation, timed perfectly to coincide with what I knew would be my family's annual Thanksgiving gathering. The segment contrasted the foundation's mission, empowering overlooked young women, with a not-so-subtle exposé of Logan's failed law practice and my parents' financial mismanagement. The facts spoke louder than any revenge plot ever could. That afternoon, my inbox filled with messages from strangers, women who saw themselves in my story, parents who promised to do better for their daughters, and countless young creators thanking me for believing in them. And somewhere, in a house where I had once begged to be noticed, I knew my family was watching the same broadcast and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that they no longer had any power over me. I had built something bigger than their approval, something stronger than their absence, something that would outlive their silence. The shift was subtle at first, like waking up one morning and realizing the weight you've been carrying isn't there anymore. For most of my life, family had meant something painful, obligation without love, judgment without understanding, presence only when it was convenient. But as the weeks turned into months after that confrontation, the definition began to change. Family, I realized, wasn't blood. It was choice. It was the people who showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And that choice began with Maya. She was 17, quiet, and brilliant in a way that reminded me painfully of myself at that age, determined but invisible. When I first read her scholarship application, her words leapt off the page. I want to make films because my family never listens. Maybe the world will. It was like looking into a mirror. Maya's short documentary, a deeply personal film about finding her voice in a house where no one heard her, won the foundation's inaugural scholarship. The day I handed her the certificate, she hugged me so tightly I almost forgot to breathe. "You're the reason I believe I can do this," she whispered. That moment changed me. It wasn't about the money or the headlines, or even the satisfaction of proving my family wrong. It was about creating spaces where young women like Maya didn't have to beg to be seen. It was about building the kind of support system I had always needed and giving it freely. Our mentorship meetings became the highlight of my week. We met in the foundation's sunlit studio, a space filled with editing bays, cameras, and endless potential. Maya would bring me rough cuts of her projects, and I'd guide her through framing, pacing, and storytelling. "Try shifting the camera slightly to the left," I'd say. "Watch how the light falls across your subject." Every session reminded me how far I'd come from the girl who once hid her art in a drawer because no one cared, to the woman helping others share their stories with the world. It wasn't just Maya, either. The foundation quickly grew into a network, a family of young filmmakers, designers, and writers. They were talented, hungry, and often overlooked by the very people who should have believed in them. And yet, within our walls, they were celebrated, seen, heard. Despite the joy this new family brought me, the old ones still hovered at the edges of my life, refusing to let go. The attempts at manipulation became more creative. First, there were the handmade cards from Logan's twins, delivered to my office by courier. "We miss Aunt Caroline," they read, written in handwriting I suspected wasn't theirs. Then came the calls from a family attorney, hinting at moral obligations. And finally, an email from my mother. "We always believed in you." It was a rewriting of history so shameless it almost made me laugh. "They're using every lever they can," Ethan said one evening, flipping through the latest round of guilt trips spread across our kitchen counter. "They're desperate," I replied. And they were, because for the first time, their old tricks didn't work. The guilt slid off me like rain against glass. The shame that once defined me had nowhere to stick, and the anger that had fueled me for so long began to transform into something deeper, compassion, not for them, but for myself. Still, doubt crept in occasionally, usually late at night when the house was quiet and the world felt too big. One evening, I sat on the couch watching Maya's scholarship interview again. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held the same weariness I saw in my own wedding photos. "What if I'm wrong?" I asked Ethan, breaking the silence. "About what?" "About cutting them off. What if boundaries are just a way of running away?" Ethan looked at me carefully. "If Maya came to you and told you her family treated her the way yours treated you, what would you tell her?" The answer came instantly. "I'd tell her she deserves people who see her worth." "Then why should you deserve anything less?" he asked. His words settled into me like a stone in still water, rippling outward, reshaping everything they touched. No, boundaries weren't abandonment. They were self-respect. They were choosing peace over proximity. They were the difference between running from and walking toward. And so I walked toward something new. Ihio, our home became a sanctuary, a place where laughter flowed freely and support was given without expectation. Thanksgiving that year wasn't spent with people who demanded forgiveness without accountability. It was spent around a long wooden table filled with chosen family. Ethan sat beside me, Naomi across from us, my team scattered along the sides, and Maya, her scholarship certificate framed on the mantel, sat at the far end. "To those who see us as we are," I toasted, my voice steady. "To those who see us," they echoed. There was no tension, no judgment, no invisible scoreboard, only warmth, honesty, and a deep, almost sacred sense of belonging. And as if to seal the transformation, the world began to respond. The Foundation's second round of scholarships received more than 2,000 applications. Donations poured in from corporations and philanthropists eager to support the cause. We partnered with film festivals, mentorship programs, and schools across the country. And with each milestone, the message became clearer. Family isn't who you're born to, it's who chooses to build with you. Even public opinion shifted decisively. Articles stopped mentioning my family at all. Interviews focused on the mission, the impact, the future. At award ceremonies, people didn't introduce me as the woman who defied her parents. They introduced me as the founder of one of the most influential, creative foundations in the country. The past wasn't erased. It was simply outgrown. One evening, months later, Ethan and I walked past a coffee shop downtown. Through the window, I saw my parents, older, smaller, somehow diminished, sitting side by side. Our eyes met for a fleeting second, and then I kept walking. There was no anger, no longing, no urge to go inside. Just a quiet, peaceful acknowledgement of what had been, and what would never be again. They had taught me what love wasn't. But my work, my chosen family, and my purpose had taught me what love truly is. And that, more than any revenge, any Porsche, any headline, was the ultimate victory. A year later, I found myself standing in a sunlit studio, not the cramped apartment corner where I once edited videos on a borrowed laptop, but the spacious creative space of the Rivera Media Foundation, filled with light, laughter, and purpose. The walls were lined with framed photographs, stills from documentaries, short films, and digital projects created by the young women our foundation had supported. Each image told a story that might never have been told if someone hadn't believed in their worth. Each one reminded me of how far I had come, and how far I was still determined to go. Maya was there that morning, hunched over her camera as she adjusted the settings for her latest project. Her focus was intense, her movements careful, deliberate. "What do you think about this angle?" she asked, glancing up. "Try shifting it slightly to the left," I suggested. "Catch the way the light falls across her face. See how it changes the mood?" It was a small detail, but Maya nodded like it was a revelation. Watching her work, watching her become more confident, more sure of her voice, filled me with a pride that felt completely different from anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't the hollow, aching pride I used to feel when trying to impress my parents. This was something richer, deeper, pride without desperation. Pride rooted in impact. Later, she invited me to watch her latest documentary. It followed 3 generations of women from a rural Oregon town, their struggles, their resilience, their dreams. The story was raw and beautiful, and as the final credits rolled, Maya turned to me with tears shining in her eyes. "You're the reason I believe I can do this," she whispered, hugging me tightly. I closed my eyes and thought of Miss Rivera, my high school media teacher, the only adult who had ever truly seen me back then. She had come to every one of my art exhibitions, even when my parents didn't. She had written me letters of recommendation when no one else would. She had believed in me when I couldn't yet believe in myself. Now, that belief was rippling forward into a new generation. The cycle of neglect had ended. The cycle of support had begun. A few weeks later, I stood at the podium of the Portland Arts Center, accepting the Community Leadership Award in front of a crowd of hundreds. As I looked out over the sea of faces, donors, scholars, friends, colleagues, I felt a profound calm. There were no empty seats haunting me this time, no phantom figures I wished had shown up. Every person in that room was there because they wanted to be. They were part of my life not out of obligation, but out of choice. This journey I began started in invisibility. For years, I measured my worth by the approval I couldn't earn from people who refused to give it. But now, I measure it by what we build together. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just applause, it was validation. It was the sound of a woman who had stopped asking to be seen and instead built something impossible to ignore. Life continued to unfold with a kind of beauty I had once believed was reserved for other people. Ethan and I created new holiday traditions that had nothing to do with the ones I'd grown up with. Quiet Thanksgiving dinners with chosen family, summer barbecues with scholarship recipients and their mentors, New Year's parties filled with laughter and purpose instead of tension and resentment. Naomi, my first investor, had retired and now spent her time advising young female founders, often stopping by the foundation to mentor alongside me. We launched new initiatives, including an emergency fund to help students facing unexpected financial hardship, and watched as our alumni began to win film festivals, publish books, and launch creative startups of their own. Each success story felt like another stitch in a tapestry of legacy, one that had nothing to do with the family name I was born into, and everything to do with the family I had built. One afternoon, as I drove through downtown Portland in my Porsche, the same one that had once reignited my parents' attention, I passed the tiny coffee shop where I had spent countless nights editing my first videos. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of two familiar figures. Mom and Dad. Older now. Smaller, somehow. They were walking slowly, side by side, talking quietly. Our eyes met briefly through the glass, just for a second. And in that second, something extraordinary happened. I felt nothing. No anger. No longing. No bitterness. Just a calm, quiet acknowledgement. They had taught me what love isn't. And the life I had built, the love I had chosen and given and received, had taught me what love truly is. I didn't stop the car. I didn't wave. I simply drove on, a soft smile tugging at the corners of my lips. Tomorrow, Maya would begin shooting her next project, a documentary on resilience and creativity. I'd promised to be there, camera in hand, mentoring her every step of the way. That thought filled me with a joy that no family reunion could ever match. Because in the end, family isn't the people who raised you. Family is the people who lift you. It's the mentor who shows up for your art show. It's the partner who holds your hand when the world turns its back. It's the team that builds beside you and the next generation that carries your work forward. I once believed my story was about revenge, about proving myself to people who never cared. But standing here now, surrounded by purpose, legacy, and love, I understand the truth. It was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was always enough. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or helped you see that you deserve better, then I hope you'll stay with us for more stories like this. Subscribe, share, and above all, never forget, Your worth isn't measured by who sees you. It's measured by what you build and by the love you choose to give. Detail